Woman sees her millionaire ex-husband and his lover at a party. But what happened, no one expected. Subscribe to the channel to receive exciting stories and leave your like to continue watching. The rain was pounding the streets of New York that night. Sophie's car window was fogged up, and the lights from the street lamps reflected off the drops dripping down the windshield. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitened by the strength with which she squeezed her own hands. Her chest hurt. Not a physical pain, but that suffocating pain that seems to take over the soul and leave everything hollow inside. She would never forget that night, the night her life fell apart. The phone vibrated on the dashboard. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. Her husband, the man she had devoted every year of the last decade to. Sophie hesitated before answering, feeling a tightness in her stomach. "Hello?" Her voice came out shaky. On the other end, a heavy sigh. "Sophie, we need to talk." Something was wrong. She could feel it. His voice was distant, cold. It wasn't like before when he'd call her "my love" or laugh on the phone before he'd even said anything. "Daniel, what's going on?" The silence was unbearable. "Can we meet at home soon?" he finally asked. Sophie's heart was pounding in her chest. She wanted answers, now. "Just say it, Daniel." His voice rose in a tone of desperation. "What's going on?" And then he said, coldly, bluntly, without hesitation, "I want a divorce." The words were like a blow. Sophie felt as if the ground had opened up under her feet. The air became heavy, hard to breathe. "What?" "I met someone." "I'm sorry, Sophie, but I love someone else." The phrase echoed in her mind like thunder. Her eyes were burning. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to explode. "Do you love someone else?" Her voice broke. "I didn't want it to be like this." He sighed. "But I can't pretend anymore." Sophie tasted the bitterness of betrayal even before she fully understood what was happening. "Who is she?" Another silence. She heard a noise in the background, a whisper, and then a female voice. "Daniel, are you going to be long?" Sophie felt an electric shock run through her body. She didn't need anything else. She didn't need to hear another explanation, another excuse, another pathetic attempt to smooth things over. He was already with her at that moment. The call dropped, and Sophie sat there in the car staring at nothing. The tears came silently at first. Then they came like a storm. The next few days were a blur. Sophie refused to leave the room. His smell was still on the sheets. His clothes were still in the closet. His wedding ring still weighed on her finger like a cruel reminder of what they had once been. She spent sleepless nights reliving every moment of their marriage. When did it all start to fall apart? Flashback. 2 years earlier, Sophie remembered their last trip together. They were in Paris. Daniel held her hand as they strolled along the Champs-Élysées, and she felt safe, loved, or at least she thought so. "Do you promise we'll come back here one day?" she asked, smiling at him. Daniel kissed her forehead. "I promise." But now looking back, Sophie wondered, when did that promise break? Were there signs that she ignored? The excuses for coming home late, the increasingly frequent work trips, the way he stopped looking at her the way he used to. She realized, too late, that the cracks had always been there. She just refused to see them. Months later, on television, a report was about a gala event for Daniel's company. The cameras showed couples smiling, businessmen shaking hands, and then, there he was. Daniel, in a black tuxedo holding a glass of champagne, and next to her, Melissa, the woman he'd left her for, young, elegant, beautiful. Melissa wore a tight red dress, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. She smiled at Daniel as if she knew exactly what she had done, as if she knew she had won. Sophie felt a bitter taste in her mouth. After all, what did Melissa have that she didn't? And then, as if the universe wanted to destroy Sophie completely, the reporter asked, "Daniel, rumor has it that your marriage ended recently. Is that true?" Daniel looked at Melissa before answering. "Some things just come to an end, but life always surprises us with new opportunities." Sophie clenched her fists. Her chest burned. The tears came again, but this time something inside her changed. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't let Daniel and Melissa win. If he moved on, then so would she. Sophie took a deep breath and wiped her face. The woman she had been before had died there, and in that instant, without her knowing it, a new Sophie began to be born. That night, Sophie looked at herself in the mirror for longer than usual. The pale, haggard face of the previous months had disappeared. In its place was a woman who had learned to get back on her feet, who had rebuilt her life brick by brick. She still bore scars, but now they were just the marks of battles won. In the beginning it was difficult. The first step always is. After the divorce, she had to relearn how to live without depending on anyone. The money she received in the court settlement was enough to make a fresh start, but not to live without worries. For the first time in years, Sophie had to face the real world alone. At first, the job market seemed cruel. Her business degree seemed almost obsolete after so many years out of the business, dedicated to a marriage that, in the end, left her with nothing but bitter memories. The condescending looks at job interviews, the polite rejections and the closed doors were a blow to her already fragile self-esteem. But she didn't give up. Sophie started from scratch. She took a job as an assistant in a small consultancy firm, even though she knew she was qualified for much more. She worked tirelessly, absorbing everything she could. She stayed late at the office, studied at night and made contacts. Within a few months, she had become indispensable to the company, and within a year, she was promoted. Recognition came quickly. Her determination and intelligence were undeniable. When she realized that she had learned everything she could in that job, Sophie made the boldest decision of her life. She resigned and started her own company. It was a risk. Sleepless nights, fear, uncertainty. But for the first time, fear didn't paralyze her. It drove her forward. She used every lesson learned in her failed marriage, every humiliation and pain as fuel to grow. And then, 2 years passed. Sophie now owned a financial consultancy company that was growing by leaps and bounds. She had become respected in the market, an independent, confident, powerful woman. The days of crying and self-pity were behind her. She had proved to herself that happiness depended on no one but herself. That evening, while getting ready for the gala event, Sophie smiled as she saw her image in the mirror. The elegant black dress hugged her curves perfectly. Her hair, which had always been tied up in a lifeless bun, now fell in sophisticated waves over her shoulders. The red lipstick highlighted her confidence, and the high heels made her feel even more imposing. She didn't need that party to feel validated. But it was an important event in the business world, and she had been personally invited by the host. That meant she had reached the top. The past no longer defined her. The hall was lit by crystal chandeliers and filled with business people, celebrities, and influential figures. Sophie walked in with her head held high, greeting a few acquaintances. She felt good, as if she finally belonged there. But then something unexpected happened. She felt a gaze burning in her direction. Sophie followed her instinct and slowly turned her head. On the other side of the room, a man was standing there holding a glass of champagne, dumbfounded. His eyes were wide, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Daniel, her ex-husband, the man who had betrayed her, humiliated her and discarded her as if she were irrelevant. Time had not been as kind to him as it had been to Sophie. His face bore the marks of stress, and his eyes had a different glow, something between surprise and regret. And then Sophie noticed something even more shocking. Next to him, holding his arm with a tense expression, was Melissa, the woman Daniel had left her for. The entire hall seemed to disappear for a moment. Everything around lost sound, color, and movement. Only 3 people seemed to exist in that space, Sophie, Daniel, and Melissa, and in that instant, Sophie knew that that night would change everything. She felt every eye on her as she stood motionless in the center of the room. Daniel was still standing there, looking stunned, as if he couldn't believe the woman he saw in front of him. Time had passed for both of them, but the difference was glaring. While he looked worn out, carrying the weight of choices he had perhaps already begun to question, Sophie looked stunning, radiant, indomitable. Melissa noticed. She noticed before Daniel even understood. His body was rigid, his eyes unable to turn away from Sophie, as if he were seeing a ghost of something that had once belonged to him and now seemed unattainable. Melissa didn't like the way she felt. She didn't like the way Daniel reacted. She knew that Sophie was different, more confident, more sophisticated, more powerful than ever, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "Darling, are you all right?" Melissa's voice was sweet, but there was something sharp in it. Daniel blinked a few times, coming out of his trance, trying to disguise his astonishment. "It's just surprising. I haven't seen her for years." Melissa smiled, but her chest tightened. Lately, she had felt that Daniel was distant. Little details that hadn't bothered her before now seemed to shout at her. The nights when he came home late without explanation, the silent dinners, the way he looked at his cell phone and sighed before putting it in his pocket. She didn't feel as safe as she used to. And now, seeing Sophie, that insecurity grew like a shadow in her mind. So, Melissa made a decision. If Daniel couldn't take his eyes off Sophie, then she would make sure that Sophie knew exactly who the woman next to him was now. With calculated steps, she picked up her glass of champagne and walked over to Sophie. Every step was rehearsed, every movement planned to the millimeter. She wasn't going to let that woman steal the show. Sophie noticed Melissa approaching but showed no reaction. She already knew what was coming next. For a long time, she had been naive enough to believe that some people simply moved on without having to destroy others. But now, she knew the truth. Melissa wasn't coming to greet her. Melissa was coming to mark her territory. "Sophie, what a surprise to find you here." Melissa's voice was sweet, but poison oozed through the words. Sophie smiled, remaining impassive. "Melissa, how are you?" Melissa tilted her head slightly as if observing something curious. "I see life has been kind to you. You look stunning." Sophie held her gaze without flinching. "Life has been fair to me. And you?" The question caught Melissa off guard for a second. Her smile faltered but soon returned to her face. "I've never been better. After all, I married the man of my dreams. Daniel is a wonderful husband." Sophie noticed the sparkle in Melissa's eyes, a sparkle that wasn't one of happiness but of defiance. She didn't need to hear that. She didn't need a dispute. Time had taught her that some battles are won simply by choosing not to fight. "I'm happy for you," Sophie replied, her voice unchanged. But before she could end the conversation and walk away, a familiar sound made her freeze. Daniel's laughter. Sophie turned her head slightly, and there he was. Still standing in the same place, talking to another group of businessmen, but now next to him there was another woman, and she was laughing. Melissa noticed the change in Sophie's expression and followed her gaze, and that's when she saw it. A young woman, dark hair, flawless skin, a red dress that perfectly shaped her curves. She leaned slightly towards Daniel, resting her hand on his arm intimately. Melissa felt a chill run down her spine. "Daniel, who is that?" Her voice wavered. The young woman smiled, completely ignoring Melissa's presence. "I'm Emily. Didn't Daniel tell you about me?" The entire hall seemed to fall silent at that moment. Melissa blinked, confused, trying to process what was happening. "What?" She looked at Daniel, expecting an explanation, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a misunderstanding. But he said nothing. The color disappeared from Melissa's face. Nausea overtook her body as Sophie's words echoed in her mind. "Life has been fair to me. And you?" "Fair." Melissa felt the weight of that word now. Sophie watched the scene without saying anything. She didn't need to. There was no satisfaction in seeing Melissa betrayed in the same way she had once been. But there was something inevitable there. The truth always finds a way to reveal itself. Daniel tried to keep his composure, but Sophie noticed. She saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Regret. For the first time, he really saw her. Not as the woman he left, but as the woman he should never have lost. But it was already too late. Sophie picked up her glass and swirled the liquid around in it, without hurrying. The chaos happening in front of her was no longer her problem. She was above it. She was above them all. And then, without saying a word, Sophie turned away and disappeared down the hall, leaving Daniel and Melissa to face the weight of their own choices. The silence between Melissa and Daniel became unbearable. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in shock, and the hand holding the champagne glass trembled slightly. She looked at Emily again, as if she needed to be sure that this woman was really there, next to her husband, so comfortable, so safe. Daniel. Melissa's voice came out lower than she had intended. She cleared her throat and tried again, now with a firmer tone. Who is this woman? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. His eyes danced between Melissa and Emily, but he said nothing. Melissa took a step forward, feeling the pressure in her chest increase. I'm waiting, Daniel. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy the situation. She smiled, resting her hand gently on Daniel's arm, as if he belonged to her. Oh dear, don't you really know? Emily laughed, a light, venomous sound. That's embarrassing. Melissa felt her stomach turn. Every cell in her body was begging for this to be a misunderstanding, for Daniel to deny it, to say something that would get her out of this humiliating position. But he didn't deny it. He didn't say anything. Daniel just looked away, bringing the glass of champagne to his lips in a hurry, as if he wanted to hide behind the glass. And that's when Melissa understood. She felt a chill run down her spine. Her heart began to beat fast, not from love, but from fear. Fear that everything she had built up, her image, her status, her marriage, was about to crumble in front of everyone. You... Melissa swallowed. Her face contracted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. Are you cheating on me, Daniel? Several heads began to turn. The hall was huge, full of businessmen, politicians, and socialites, but now many eyes were on them. A murmur began to grow around them. Daniel finally looked at Melissa. He opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it. He didn't have a reason. I don't think this is the place for... The place? Melissa laughed humorlessly, feeling tears burn her eyes. She pointed at Emily. So that's why you've been so distant lately? You're sleeping with this... Hey, watch your words, Emily interrupted, her voice laced with irony. You've been in my shoes before, remember? I think you know very well how this works. Melissa lost her breath for a moment. She's been in Emily's shoes. She was Emily to Sophie. The truth hit her like a punch. Daniel walked past her, trying to minimize the scandal. He muttered something low, trying to calm her down. But Melissa was beside herself. She wasn't Sophie. She wouldn't accept being discarded. You're pathetic, Daniel. I gave up everything for you. I made enemies for you. I became a joke to be by your side. And now you just throw it all away for this girl. Daniel sighed and wiped his hands across his face in exasperation. He looked away, aware that they were attracting too much attention. He couldn't lose his composure there. Can we talk about this later? Later? After? Melissa shouted. All eyes were on them now. Emily, for her part, just watched, crossing her arms and smiling. Daniel took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment and turned to leave. He needed a breather. He needed to think. But as soon as he had taken a few steps away from the confusion, something caught his eye from across the hall. Sophie, and she wasn't alone. A tall, imposing man had just arrived at her side. An impeccable suit hugged his strong body, and his smile was confident. The whole hall knew him. Michael Carter, billionaire CEO, one of the most influential men in the country. Daniel watched with a tightness in his chest as Michael placed one of his hands on Sophie's waist in a natural, intimate way, as if he belonged there. Sophie turned her face towards him and smiled, a genuine smile full of something Daniel hadn't seen in her for years. Freedom. And then it happened. Michael leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a quick kiss, nor was it shy. It was the kind of kiss that made it clear to everyone in the room that Sophie was no longer a lonely woman, that she belonged to another man. Daniel felt something cold crawl up his spine. Anger, jealousy, possession. He clenched his fists at his sides, unaware that Melissa was still shouting after him, without realizing that Emily was watching him with a look of boredom, Nothing else mattered at that moment, because while he had two women fighting over him, his gaze was locked on Sophie. And for the first time in years he realized that perhaps he had lost something that he could never get back. Daniel couldn't look away. The whole hall seemed distant. The voices around him became just muffled noises. All he could see at that moment was Sophie in the arms of another man. She was radiant, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in years, perhaps in a way he'd never seen before. And then, without hesitation, Michael kissed her again, this time longer, more intentionally, as if to make it clear to everyone there that Sophie was his now. Daniel's stomach churned. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth, a tight lump in his throat. Jealousy. Anger. A feeling of possession that he didn't even know still existed inside him. But it wasn't just that. It was something deeper. A belated recognition of what he had lost. Behind him, Melissa was still arguing, now ignored by everyone around her. She gesticulated, spoke too quickly, her voice filled with despair and indignation. Emily, on the other hand, watched the scene with a victorious smile on her lips, as if she had already known the moment would come. But Daniel was no longer there. At least not in body and soul. He was completely immersed in what he was seeing across the hall. Sophie turned to Michael with an amused look, as if the excessive attention on them didn't bother her in the slightest. On the contrary, she seemed to enjoy it. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore. After everything she'd been through, Daniel realized that nothing he did could affect her now, and that bothered him even more. He had always thought that Sophie would be his shadow. That even after the divorce she would still be there, hurt, broken, unable to move on. But now seeing her next to Michael, one of the most powerful figures in the country, a man who could have any woman by his side, made something inside Daniel turn around in a way he hadn't expected. Melissa finally noticed that he was no longer listening to her. She followed his gaze, and when she saw Sophie and Michael, her face contorted, first in surprise, then in anger. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice laced with hatred. "After everything that's happened here, after humiliating me in front of everyone, is that what you're thinking?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He kept watching Sophie, as if trying to decipher every detail of her expression. Melissa laughed in disbelief. "It can't be. You're jealous of her." This time, Daniel turned his eyes away from Sophie and faced Melissa. Her gaze was filled with a mixture of pain and anger. For the first time he really saw what he was doing. The woman he had left Sophie for now stood before him, ruined, wounded, and he just didn't care. He opened his mouth to say something, but Melissa held up her hand, preventing him from speaking. "You know what, Daniel? You deserve all this. You deserve to lose. You deserve to see someone else take the place that was once yours." Her words should have hit him, but they didn't. Melissa pushed him away and walked out with firm steps, ignoring the stares around her. Emily rolled her eyes and let out a low laugh before also walking away. Now Daniel was alone. Or at least that's how he felt. He couldn't explain what was going on inside him. He should be worrying about Melissa. He should be thinking about how to sort out the mess he'd gotten himself into. He should be focused on something other than Sophie. But all he could think about was her. He watched as Michael took her hand, leading her through the hall. They seemed like the perfect couple, and it was eating him up inside. Suddenly, Sophie stopped walking. She felt something, as if she could feel Daniel's eyes burning into her back. Slowly, she turned and faced him. Their gazes met. The world stopped for a second, and then Sophie smiled. Not a smile of nostalgia, not a smile of spite. It was the smile of someone who had moved on, of someone who had won. It was the greatest humiliation Daniel could have received, and for the first time since it all began, he realized that perhaps he had never been the man Sophie deserved. But now it was too late. Soft music filled the room, but for Daniel, everything seemed distant. He no longer heard the conversations around him, no longer saw the curious looks on his face. All that existed was Sophie. She was there, laughing, radiant, talking to other people as if he had never existed. The scene was almost surreal. For years he had imagined that if he ever saw her again, she would be different. Perhaps tired, perhaps still resentful. But no. Sophie had not only moved on, she had blossomed in a way he had never expected. Daniel downed another shot of whiskey, feeling the liquid burn down his throat. It wasn't his first glass, nor the second, nor the third. He had lost count of how many times the waiter had refilled his glass. He shouldn't be drinking so much. But with every glance he threw at Sophie, with every laugh she let out next to Michael, the need to drown that unbearable feeling only grew. Why did it bother him so much? He should be satisfied. He was Daniel, a successful, powerful man. He had everything he wanted, but somehow that night he felt as if he had nothing. Melissa had left after her outburst. Emily, realizing that she would no longer have his attention, had also left him alone in the bar. And now he was there, completely alone, glued to Sophie and drinking non-stop. She seemed so untouchable. Daniel hated to admit it, but that new version of her scared him. For years he had been sure that Sophie would always be a closed chapter, a ghost from the past that would remain trapped in his memories. But now, seeing her like this, seeing her so unperturbed, he realized the size of the mistake he had made. And then he saw the opportunity. Michael turned away for a moment, murmuring something in Sophie's ear before walking off towards the bathroom. Daniel waited just a few seconds before getting up, holding his glass of whiskey tightly. His heart was beating fast, but he ignored the sensation. He didn't know exactly what he would say. He didn't know what he wanted to taste, but something inside him screamed that he needed to talk to her. Sophie's back was turned when he approached, but before he could say anything, she seemed to sense his presence. She turned slowly, and when her eyes met his, Daniel felt the impact. It was as if all the past came back at once, crushing him. Sophie stared at him for a few seconds, then unhurriedly brought the glass of champagne to her lips and took a sip. Daniel. His name left her lips without emotion, without anger, without longing. Just a cold acknowledgement of his presence. He swallowed. Now that he was there, he didn't know where to start. You're... He hesitated, searching for the words. Different. Sophie arched an eyebrow, as if that realization was so obvious that it wasn't even worth commenting on. Yes, she replied simply. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, trying to find a foothold in a conversation that seemed lost even before it began. I didn't expect to see you here. Sophie smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a quiet, secure smile without any fragility. The business world is small, that was inevitable. He took a deep breath. This was turning out worse than he had imagined. Can we talk? Sophie tilted her head slightly, analyzing him. About what, exactly? Daniel hesitated. He didn't know. He didn't know what he wanted to hear from her. Apologies, understanding, a chance to explain. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the alcohol on his body. I just wanted to know how you were. Sophie let out a low laugh, not in mockery but in disbelief. You want to know how I am? After all this time? Daniel felt his stomach turn. He didn't like the way this conversation was going. He didn't want to seem like a sorry man. He didn't want to show weakness. But standing there in front of her, he no longer knew what he was doing. Sophie took a step forward. Her eyes were fixed on his, and Daniel felt that for the first time it was he who was vulnerable in this relationship. I'm fine, Daniel, really well. Better than I've ever been. He swallowed dryly. Do you miss something? She looked at him for a moment, as if pondering the answer. Then she smiled again. Yes. Daniel felt his chest tighten, but before he could feel any hope, Sophie added, I miss myself. The woman I was before you. The woman I left behind to try to be good enough for a man who never appreciated me. Daniel blinked, feeling as if he'd been hit. Sophie didn't hate him. She just didn't care anymore. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, a voice came from behind him. Is there a problem here? Michael was back. He stopped next to Sophie and, without hesitation, put his hand on her waist. It was a natural, intimate touch. Daniel felt every muscle in his body contract. Sophie turned to Michael and smiled in a way that made Daniel feel a bitter taste in his mouth. No problem. Michael put his arm around her and, without even a second glance at Daniel, guided her away. Daniel stood there, holding the empty cup. The weight of reality fell hard on him. For the first time he realized that he had lost Sophie, not because she had found another man, but because she had found something much more valuable. She had found herself. And now there was no more room for him in her life. The hall seemed to revolve around him. He turned and walked to the bar again, feeling an emptiness growing inside him. The waiter looked at him, expecting a new order. Daniel squeezed the glass in his hand, feeling the anguish grow. "Give me another." The waiter hesitated, but soon obeyed. And while Sophie danced alongside Michael, laughing, living, Daniel sank deeper and deeper into his own darkness. Because now it didn't matter how many women were by his side. He only wanted the one who would never come back. Daniel left the party feeling heavy in the chest, as if something was closing in on him. The cool breeze of the New York night hit his face as he stopped on the sidewalk, the echoes of the music and laughter still ringing out in the distance. He looked over and saw his private driver waiting in the distance, but for some reason he didn't want to get in the car. He didn't want to go home. He didn't want to face the suffocating silence of his apartment. Without thinking too much, he raised his hand and called a cab. As soon as he got in, he leaned back in the seat and let out a long sigh. The driver asked where he should take him, and Daniel hesitated for a moment before giving the address. The car began to move, and he leaned his elbow on the window, watching the city lights go by in blurs. He reached into his pocket for his cell phone, opened the screen and, on impulse, went onto social media. He knew he shouldn't have, but he couldn't help it. The first thing he saw was a recent photo from the party. Sophie and Michael were together, laughing. She was holding a glass of champagne and tilting her head slightly towards him, as if they were exchanging a secret. The comments were full of compliments. What a power couple. Sophie deserved a man like that. Michael and her are a perfect match. Daniel must be biting himself right now, huh? He clutched the phone tightly. There was a bitter taste in his mouth. The notification of a new story appeared at the top of the screen. Michael Carter and Sophie Taylor, the couple of the moment. The billionaire CEO and the successful businesswoman are spotted together at a gala event, sparking rumors of a possible romance. Daniel blocked the screen and threw his cell phone on the seat next to him, feeling his heart race. He didn't know if it was anger, frustration, or regret. Maybe it was all of these mixed together. The cab stopped in front of the luxury apartment building where he lived. Daniel got out, ignoring the doorman who greeted him, and walked straight into the elevator. The mirror reflected his tired expression, the slightly loosened tie, the heavy eyes of someone who had had too much to drink. The door to his apartment closed behind him, and for the first time that night the silence hit him like a blow. He took off his jacket, threw it on the sofa, and made his way to the bar. He filled a glass with whiskey, but before he could drink, he heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. He frowned. Melissa. She walked in with firm steps, wearing a different dress from the one she had on at the party, as if she had passed somewhere before coming there. Her face was serious, and her red eyes indicated that she had been crying. Daniel took a deep breath. He wasn't in the mood for another argument. "What are you doing here?" Melissa closed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "Getting my things." He let out a low, humorless laugh. "I thought you were going to do it tomorrow." "I thought you'd be a faithful husband, but look," she retorted, smiling sarcastically. Daniel rolled his eyes and took a sip of his whiskey. "I don't want to fight." "Neither do I." She moved closer, analyzing him for a moment. "But you know what's funny, Daniel? I used to think you were a selfish bastard, but now I see you're even worse than that." He raised an eyebrow, bored. "Oh, yeah? What else am I?" Melissa leaned a little, leaning on the bar stool. "A man obsessed with something he can never have again, and that makes me happy." The air seemed heavy for a moment. Daniel looked away, but she continued. "You didn't even realize that Emily was using you, that I was using you. You like to be desired, to feel in control, but deep down, the only thing you really want is what you can no longer have." "Sophie," he murmured without thinking. Melissa laughed, shaking her head. "I knew it. You were blinded by her at that party. And honestly, I hope you never forget her." "Why her?" Melissa picked up her bag from the sofa and gave him one last look. She forgot you a long time ago." And with that, Melissa left. The apartment returned to silence. Daniel looked down at the glass of whiskey in his hand and felt a lump in his throat. He had lost Melissa, but above all, he had lost Sophie. And perhaps that was the one mistake he would never be able to fix. Time passed. Emily showed up the next morning as if nothing had happened. She entered the apartment with the confidence of someone who knew she still had a place there. "Good morning, love." Daniel, who was sitting on the balcony drinking coffee and looking out over the city without actually seeing her, didn't answer straight away. Emily came closer, slipping her arms around his neck. "Are we going out for dinner tonight?" He hesitated for a moment, but then forced a smile and nodded. Of course. If he couldn't have Sophie, perhaps he should convince himself that he could still have something. But deep down, he knew. Nothing would ever be the same again. The months passed like a blur. Time, which had once seemed his greatest enemy, was now just a silent reminder that life went on, regardless of how he felt. Daniel tried to move on. He tried to convince himself that he was still the same man he had always been. He accepted dinner invitations, frequented the same social circles, kept his name high. But something inside him had changed. Emily was still by his side, always smiling, always perfect. She knew she had won, at least on paper. Sophie was out of the game. Melissa was just a distant memory, and she was now the woman at Daniel Carter's side. But deep down, Emily knew she would never have him completely. He was there, but her mind was far away. Her eyes lost their sparkle whenever something about Sophie came up in conversation, and that irritated her more than she would admit. Sophie, on the other hand, was flourishing every day. Her company expanded, her influence grew, and her happiness became visible even to those who didn't know her. She and Michael were seen together countless times, and each appearance seemed to confirm what many already suspected. He treated her like someone who deserved to be looked after. Not as a trophy, not as a possession, but as a woman worthy of being loved. Daniel tried to ignore it. He tried not to follow. But all the news reached him, whether he wanted it to or not. And, over time, he began to realize something he had never admitted before. Sophie hadn't just moved on. She had found herself. And what about him? He was still stuck in a cycle that led nowhere. It was on a rainy afternoon that something inside him finally gave way. He was in his office looking out of the window, the water dripping down the glass as if it reflected exactly how he felt. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit that he was exhausted. Exhausted of running away, exhausted of pretending, exhausted of trying to fill an emptiness that seemed to grow every day. So he did something he never thought he would do. He picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, and before he could change his mind, dialed a number. The call rang a few times before being answered. "Hello?" Sophie's voice was serene, without any extra emotion. He almost gave up at that moment. "Hi, Sophie." The silence on the other end made his heart hammer in his chest. He knew right then that she hadn't been expecting this call. "What do you want, Daniel?" He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find the right words. But there were no right words for what he wanted to say. "I just needed to say something." He heard her breathing on the other side, patient, but not exactly interested. "Say it." Daniel swallowed. He'd never been good at admitting mistakes. He'd never been good at recognizing that he'd failed. But Sophie wasn't just anyone. Sophie was the person. "I hurt you. And I was an idiot for a long time." On the other side, Sophie said nothing. "I'm not expecting this to change anything," she continued, gripping the phone tightly. "But I needed to say that. I see it now. I see everything I've done. And you deserved much more than I gave you." The silence lasted long seconds. When she finally answered, there was no anger in her voice. There was no bitterness. "I know, Daniel." He held his breath. "I know I deserved better." The simple answer, but so full of meaning, was like a punch in the chest. "I just wanted you to know," he said, feeling the knot tighten in his throat. "I know," she repeated, and this time there was a tone of kindness there, and then she did something he would never have expected. "I hope you find your peace, Daniel." He closed his eyes, feeling the words echo inside him. "Thank you, Sophie," and with that the call ended. He sat there staring at the phone, feeling a strange sensation inside him. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't regret, it was acceptance. For the first time he really accepted that Sophie was never coming back, and somehow that was liberating. Time passed, and Daniel began to change. He moved away from empty parties, reduced the amount of whiskey he drank, started to focus more on work. Not because he wanted to distract himself, but because for the first time in years he wanted to become someone better. Emily noticed the change, and one day she simply left. No big arguments, no fights. She just knew that her role there was over. Daniel didn't stop her. He let her move on, just as Sophie had, just as he himself needed to follow. It wasn't until years later, at a charity event, that Daniel saw her again. Sophie was standing next to Michael, laughing with some people. He watched her from afar, and this time he didn't feel jealous. He didn't feel anger, he felt pride. She looked in his direction for a brief moment. Their gazes met, and then Sophie smiled. Daniel smiled back. And at that moment, he knew he was finally free. Have you ever met someone who's been through something similar? Someone who was betrayed, humiliated, but managed to turn things around and showed that the best revenge is happiness? Let me know in the comments. I want to know what you think about this story. And tell me, what city are you watching this video from? If you like this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos like this. And now don't leave yet. There's an incredible video popping up on your screen that you're going to love watching. Click and check it out.